I think we are good to start the event. We are few in number today. I believe everyone's having their own weekend plans, so no worries. Nonetheless, we have a speaker today to share the session that is scheduled for today. So we shall go ahead with the event. Aries, I hope you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. So just want to do a quick introduction of this whole event in case there are people here who have joined us for the first time. So our summit started since Monday, 21st June, and it will go on till the 5th of July 2021. So as you have been attending these sessions, I request you continue attending these sessions and also learn from these, dynamic speakers that we have lined up for each of these sessions that will be covering the focus technologies. So yes, to people who have not been introduced to GSDC, we are a vendor neutral independent certification body, and we have certified over 50,000 professionals worldwide with the top technology and emerging skill based certification programs that we have, which covers DevOps, Agile, L&D, procurement, blockchain, ISO, data science, and many more. We have over 45 plus certification portfolio under us, and we've got even subject matter experts and technical board of advisors who are responsible in creating and curating these examination programs. So these technical board of advisors are also academic affiliates from prestigious universities such as Stanford, Yale, Wharton, and Harvard. We are also partnered with over 50 global training organizations who help GSDC in, conducting trainings as per the syllabus that we have designed internally. With the help of our subject matter experts and technical board of advisors, we are also proud to be accredited by American National Standards Institute and also ABI-CB. So if you'd like to understand more about this organization, I request you to please visit our website, which is www.gsdcouncil.org. Along with that, if you can also follow us on LinkedIn. So we have Setulo and also Matthew with us today, who are also the co-hosts. So if you have any questions or any requirements, they are available on chat to assist you throughout the event. We have also opened this DTO Summit 2021 community LinkedIn group for everyone, exclusively open to all the registered DTO Summit members. So I request the attendees as well as the speaker to put in their request to join this group so that we can have an internal discussion about the ongoing sessions that we have or any offline questions that you wish to get answered. So yes, the link will also be shared on the chat, so you may have a look at it. And while we are speaking about this, I also wanted to highlight that we are giving out feedback form links for each session. So I request if you can also give out the feedback for every session that we conduct. As an organization, we would like to understand how we can improve for our future events and rate the overall session as well, so that the speaker can also have an idea of how they have fared in the session that was conducted for you. We are also have the digital transformation officer certification with us, which is GSDC certified. So in case you are interested to be certified by a internationally recognized organization, then please, you can check the details on this certification program as well. The link is also shared, as you can see. All right, then, let me not take much of the time. I would like to, directly hand over the time to our speaker today, Aries. So he is a product architect with Cloud Cover and working on enterprise products for cloud-enabled applications. So in the past, Aries has worked for organizations such as VMware, Dell, and OpenStack startups, Dassault, and later Stratoscale. So these are his, achievements so far, professionally, and his interests are in digital transformation, software development, and cloud computing. So Thank you so much, Aries, for taking out this time on a weekend and presenting this session to us. So please go ahead and take over your time. And to all the viewers here again, we will have the Q&A session right after the presentation. So any questions that you want to get it answered, so please have it reserved for that allocated time. Either you can raise your hand using the reaction option or put in your questions in the chat and our speaker will be more than glad to answer them. So thanks a lot, Aries. The time is now yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And let me actually go ahead and share my screen first.
Right. I'll stop sharing.
This will stop the other sharing. Okay. Wait, I just want to confirm you can see that okay?
Yeah, this is good.
Cool. Awesome. I'll go back to the previous slide. So thank you all for joining. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you all over the world. My name's Aries. I'm based in Toronto. Thank you again for that wonderful introduction. And before we get started, I just want to thank the GSDC for setting up this summit, for inviting us as speakers, for coordinating. So that's an incredible opportunity, and especially in the absence of in-person conferences, these virtual summits and opportunities to network are fewer and far between. So thank you so much for being a part of this and setting this up. Just briefly about me, I am a product architect with CloudCover. I didn't include a slide about CloudCover. You can go to our website, cldcvr.com, if you're interested in learning more about us. We're basically a product and a consulting company. We focus on partnering with AWS, Microsoft, and Google to basically deliver digital transformations to organizations all across the world. We've worked with pretty much every major Southeast Asian unicorn. And my focus in particular is on a set of tools and products that enable DevOps and software engineers to be able to enhance their sort of velocity into deploying into the cloud. I've worked for VMware Dell in the past, and then around, I think 2013, 2014, I decided the cloud, what was known as the cloud, was starting to bubble up, and I decided I wanted to focus in on that more. So I moved into OpenStack startups, which brought me to CloudCover, brought me to Singapore. I was in Singapore for 2 years. I moved back a year ago, and I'm still with CloudCover. So let's start. What is digital transformation? And sorry, before I continue, the topic of the conversation is how CTOs and CIOs can accelerate digital transformation with cloud platforms. So the focus really is on first defining these things and then understanding the sort of tactical things that CTOs and CIOs can do as a part of these initiatives. So broadly defined, I mean, this is one of the most overused terms and buzzwords. Digital transformation definitely stands out there on its own. I've seen it described in really good ways and also not so good ways. I mean, I came upon this quote that I felt described the term quite well, and that is that digital transformation involves the use of technology to radically improve performance or the reach of the business. In a lot of ways, it holds true because at the core of all of our digital strategies, we're focused on improving the bottom line for our businesses, customers, and partners through the applications of these technologies. Now, after a year and a half of dealing with this global pandemic, the scale at which we've never really seen or experienced in our lifetimes, it's interesting how this timeline that we find ourselves on has been brought together for this perfect storm of factors, which has propelled businesses into embracing digital transformation objectives. At a point in the past, I'd say before the pandemic, you could consider it almost optional. And even that would have been debatable depending on the size of the org you found yourself in. But I mean, after January of 2020, I don't think it was optional anymore. And it became mandatory if you wanted to remain relevant. Just as an example, schools, restaurants, retailers, and companies all had to find ways of how to deal with fully remote sets of customers, users, and stakeholders. The amount of digital transformation which came out after 2020 and during 2020, I think we'll look back at, and it'll be considered one of the most remarkable achievements in computing. It'll likely compel more digital initiatives as well as we see our society sort of continue to evolve and be transformed by the power of this technology. And in a lot of ways, at its core, digital transformation is about unlocking and realizing what I would consider the transparent enterprise. All of the data that makes your business tick is being demanded and rapidly democratized. Customer experience is now king. In today's digital world, there is no place to hide when it comes to customer experience. Everything that enables your business to be productive and successful, along with the data that surrounds it, it's finding its way into being represented and connected to your customers through the web. You can't escape bad reviews and a bad customer experience. Some interesting stats for you. Millennials and Gen Z, for example, increasingly prefer to deal with customer support through interactive discussion forums. When it comes to sales, most people don't really want to reach out to sales anymore to learn about a product. Instead, they'll go to a company's website and read third-party reviews and watch videos on the product that they might be interested in. Usually they're actually contacting sales when they're about 82% of the way towards making that sale. Customers feel connection with the brands they trust because those brands embrace these digital first strategies and they find innovative, novel ways to connect with their users. And as we move forward in time, I think this trend is likely going to continue. Now, without getting too ahead of myself, I thought I'd transition into a bit of a story that revolves around one of my favorite movies, Jurassic Park. So, has anyone seen this movie? It's one of my personal favorites. Now, if you haven't, I'll try not to spoil it for you, but please, after this talk, go and watch it. Briefly, it's a movie that's directed by Steven Spielberg. It's set on a fictional island off of the coast of Costa Rica. There, a billionaire philanthropist, John Hammond, along with a team of genetic scientists, create a wildlife park of previously extinct dinosaurs. Now, although this is a fictional movie, it's still quite an amazing vision. John Hammond, played by David Attenborough, who's in white here in this still from the movie, makes some amazing scientific breakthroughs and also finds a way to commercialize this experience as a theme park resort. In this scene, we have John Hammond along with a few of the main characters of Jurassic Park looking at some dinosaur eggs about to hatch. Now, there's another character in this story, and for those of you who've seen this movie, you might know where I'm going, but if you haven't, this is Dennis Nedry. Now, remember that name because it's important, and we'll come back to it. So the dinosaurs are going to live on this utopian island alongside the resort, allowing visitors from all over the world to come and visit. They can relax and enjoy the marvel of witnessing and interacting with real dinosaurs while they vacation with their families. Think for a second. I know it's a movie, but just think the amount of planning and operational complexity that's required to manage, such a grand venture. There's a lot of engineering. There's a lot of money and attention to detail poured into designing Jurassic Park. This effort was likely huge. Now, without spoiling the movie too much, it all goes catastrophically wrong. There's a series of industrial problems that strike, and the dream at which is Jurassic Park, it comes to an end. But, it makes for a great movie. Now, I always thought as a young boy when I watched this, that this movie was a sci-fi thriller. The action scenes were all very well done. A lot of work went into CGI rendering and animatronics to sort of bring these dinosaurs to life for the audience. When I watched it as a young boy, I always felt the reason that disaster is striking was not because we did anything wrong. It's just because dinosaurs are wild. They're untamed creatures. How can we, as mere humans, contain these massive beasts? Even though a lot appeared to be invested into security and keeping everyone safe and the park under control, it all failed at the end. So not only was Jurassic Park a commercial disaster, it actually ended up putting real human lives at risk. Now, fast forward to 2021. Watching it again now, I realized this movie wasn't about the threat of dinosaurs. The whole reason Jurassic Park failed was not because John Hammond was being too ambitious. It was because he overlooked a very critical core component of the operation of Jurassic Park. It's not a story about humanity's inability to control nature. Rather, it's a story about a catastrophic digital failure. And it all revolves around this guy, Dennis Nedry. I showed you a photo of him 2 slides back. So he's played by Wayne Knight, who you might remember from Seinfeld. Dennis is truly the worst IT guy. He's temperamental. He's selfish. He's cocky. He's underpaid and he's underappreciated. All of Jurassic Park's security and industrial systems were designed and controlled by Dennis. His code was proprietary and undocumented. And when disaster struck and the operators tried to override his security policies, they realized that Dennis had changed the default passwords and only he knew the answers. And by that time, it was far too late. Disaster had already struck. As the movie goes on, it makes me realize that Jurassic Park would have been a smashing success had it not been for Dennis. Hiring him and structuring him at the core of Jurassic Park's digital strategy was ultimately a major oversight by John Hammond. And it still makes me scratch my head how this came to be. But hey, listen, this is a movie after all. Dennis was a major constraint, and it cost Jurassic Park its existence. And this brings me to my next point. It's clear to me, and I hope to you as well, that the success of Jurassic Park was not only tied to its technology, but its ability to apply it effectively. While the systems they had in place were strong, they weren't documented, were poorly administered, had no oversight or governance, didn't really map to any long-term vision or plan. And when it came down to a production failure, the company not only failed at sorting it, it ended up putting people's lives at risk. Now, as technology leaders, we can draw parallels to some of the things in the Jurassic Park story. At the core of every business is technology and data. The appropriate steps to govern, secure, administer, and evolve this strategy are our responsibilities. And if we don't keep up with these modern trends, we will fall behind our competition and eventually we'll become extinct, kind of like the dinosaurs brought back to life in Jurassic Park. So, given this digital landscape, it might be overwhelming to decide what initiatives you want to pursue as a part of your own digital transformation. Whatever the set of solutions that you decide upon, there are 3 ways to unlock success across these tools. We can refer to these 3 as, say, the 3 sources of inspiration that lead to a successful digital transformation. Number 1 is data, and lots of it. Wherever you find this data, it's up to you to groom it, catalog it, organize it, and process it so it can map to what your company is doing and be able to deliver some of the results you want. And data is being generated constantly. You have data that's generated every time customers interact with your website, make a purchase, go through a process, even internally with your coworkers and your employees. There's a lot of data that's being generated, and it might not be looked at, or if it's looked at, it might not be segmented and analyzed with other data sets across your organization. So keep that data in mind. Data is extremely important. Number 2, unlimited connectivity. Customers and partners are connected in more ways today than ever before. There are really no limits on how much you can deliver and imagine on behalf of your customers in today's internet age. And number 3, massive processing power. There's virtually unlimited amounts of compute resources available to you now with the advent of public clouds. So when it comes to these initiatives that you plan, dream big. Don't shy away from these massive digital transformation challenges because of your existing hardware investments maybe not cutting it. You can take advantage of near limitless amounts of compute resources, which are powered by and available by the public cloud vendors. And there's a variety of ways to not have to spend all that money through spot markets and so on. So keep these 3 in mind as we continue through this talk and consider them the 3 sources of inspiration for your digital transformation initiatives. It's important we talk about culture because truly it is not something I can underscore. You will not get very far in your digital transformation journey without adopting a digital first culture. Now, talking about culture and culture hacking, it's a broad topic. And frankly, it's beyond the scope of the time that we have today. But I will still leave you with tips here on how you can influence this, and ask yourself if your organization currently is a digital first culture. You should encourage employees and sponsor employees who want to get certified in a program or skill, hosting workshops to teach and develop these skills. Schedule regular development meetings where employees can share what they're learning, how it relates to their work, and get other team members interested in what they have learned. In the great words of Simon Sinek, start with why. And this, by the way, is the title of one of my favorite books from Simon. Start with why. Ask yourself why you're engaged in this journey. Why is your customer interested in this? Why are we so motivated by digital technologies to begin with? Our commitment to continual excellence is the hallmark of our successful enterprises. And our digital initiatives are the bastions of this commitment. So no matter how tight your technology and digital strategy is, if you don't have the culture to back it, I'm almost guaranteeing you you're about to fail. Now, as CTOs and CIOs, we are already rather comfortable with the concept of the cloud, as really it's not very new anymore. Instant compute provisioning brings upon a huge variety of new applications that we can deploy in a rapid way that wouldn't have been possible before. However, when it comes to aligning our transformational goals with the technologies and practices of the cloud, it can definitely become extremely daunting. There's a lot of places to look at, a lot of tools to consider. If we focus on the applications that drive value to the customers and look at them and put the app first, the set of practices and alignment that you must empower across your org become a lot clearer and can lead to this inspired digital first thinking that leads to operational excellence. Now, can't really say cloud without DevOps, right? DevOps is one of these things where you ask 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different answers, but kind of like digital transformation possibly as well. But DevOps is a set of practices which automates the process between software devs and your IT teams. This concept of DevOps is ultimately founded on building this culture of collaboration between these teams that historically functioned in these relative silos. You contrast that with cloud computing, which represents on-demand availability of computer systems and their resources. I mean, especially data storage, networking, and compute power, without active management by the user. It's an extremely broad term, cloud computing as well. But in a nutshell, you're describing a compute resource that you can provision on the fly, and it's delivered to you through a variety of models. DevOps, it's people meeting process. And ultimately, this digital first culture that we talk about here is enabling developers, product owners, systems administrators, security officers, all the stakeholders in this org to work together cohesively, to work across these cross-functional barriers, to ultimately serve the customer, help automate and scale the constraints within an organization. Now you're working in a DevOps way. Now you're working in a digital first way. It's not a prerequisite to work this way with the cloud, but they go hand in hand. The cloud being an API-driven platform and your culture being a digital first culture, they're born to be together. Now, it's important to mention IT service management in this context of this topic, because IT service management has been along with us since the 90s, and it has evolved in various forms to modernize and support the new application landscape that digital enterprises are working with today. Back when I was in Singapore, I was working with a major bank on implementing a new private cloud technology for sensitive and regulated workloads. After months of planning and careful execution, we finally came online and began migrating applications, building and documenting tool sets, and training massive development teams. I then found myself in a lot of discussions around governance and policy and how we would continue to remain in compliance with what the regulators desired versus what the developers and systems administrators wanted. You can imagine if anyone works in a regulated corp, you know exactly where this story is going. This private bank had a lot of existing process to govern how IT worked, how apps were to be deployed, and policies around the life cycle of that application were to be applied. Now, initially, introducing this new radical technology of private cloud resulted in a lot of politics between application teams and their directors on how to best consume them and how to fit it into this model. A lot of debate, a lot of arguing ensued, but eventually policies evolved to support this message. Putting the customer first and adopting that digital first mindset greatly aided in this journey. So while DevOps is more of a philosophy, frameworks such as ITIL are codified systems of IT service management, ITSM for short, designed to better integrate IT and business needs with strategies. These practices surrounding service design, service operation, and service transition can be mapped directly to solutions that work in harmony with cloud native design and delivery. So ITIL and other related frameworks, such as, for example, COBIT, complement DevOps, the cloud, and the digital transformations that happen in the modern enterprise extremely well. Now, with cloud computing being a powerful resource, it doesn't really matter whether you want to use something on-prem versus in the cloud. It's really up to you at this point, what you want to do and where you want to run your apps. There's an abundance of private cloud technologies to leverage your existing investments in hardware and data centers. And I'll point out one vendor that I'm particularly fond of, which is OpenStack. You can use OpenStack to orchestrate a full-blown public cloud with all the capabilities of that of AWS. But keep in mind that OpenStack, while it's a great project, it does require upkeep and engineering prowess, which is required to simply, which is above and beyond what's required to contrast what would Google offer, which is simply logging into a web interface and provisioning your resources immediately. It all depends on kind of what your requirements are. And requirements like data sovereignty, regulatory compliance, and also what your devs and app teams would prefer to use must also be considered here. Tools such as Anthos and OpenShift aim to bridge a gap between standardization and the common interface that your teams would use in order to build, deploy, and manage their applications. And these tools can span across multiple clouds, both private and public. Again, though, there's always trade-offs to consider, such as vendor lock-in as being one of the potential drawbacks to this approach. And I do have to apologize, I forgot to include VMware's logo in I guess I would put them on the private cloud side. Speaking of VMware, I must also mention the most popular cloud native tool since containers, and that's Kubernetes. If you're not already familiar with Kubernetes, it's essentially a container orchestration platform that's open source and automates the scaling, deployment, and management of your containerized apps. Now, I love this strip from Dilbert because it pokes fun of how Kubernetes and cloud native has kind of become a buzzword of its own. But that said, it's still important to mention this because if you align your app strategy with Kubernetes as its platform of choice, and in the previous slide, when I was referencing OpenShift and Anthos, I mean, those are in a way distributions, enterprise distributions of Kubernetes. You've effectively architected a cloud native solution. Now, this is critical as it enhances things like app portability, scalability, and the management of this app moving forward by a very large factor. And as much as I'd love to spend a lot of time talking about Kubernetes, it does fall outside the scope of this talk. But what I want you to keep in mind is Kubernetes means cloud native. If your app can run in Kubernetes, you can run that app on your own in your private cloud. You can run it in your public cloud of choice. You can run it across platform services that span both private and public, such as Anthos or OpenShift or VMware's Tanzu. You unlock a lot of capabilities. So Kubernetes, cloud native. In 2010, Netflix gave a presentation where they described how they deploy 50 times or more per day into production. At the time, cloud native was still somewhat in its infancy, and best practices were still forming. Now, things move fast. Hype cycles came and went, but at the end of the day, DevOps and cloud became the norm, and these practices were evangelized across all major organizations. It all leads towards businesses which can turn on a dime and be able to meet their customers by deploying their solution more efficiently and faster. Now, when we say deployments, these can mean many different things. I'm referring specifically to software application deployments. These can be new product features. These can be bug fixes, security patches, A/B tests, and more. It's being agile. It means responding to your customers' needs in a much shorter period of time. It's using data to drive decisions about what comes next. At 50 deployments per day, these organizations who've embraced this digital first way of thinking are able to adapt quickly and go to market faster. Ultimately, be able to outpace their competition and increasing their value as an organization. Now, how do we get there? Where are some places that we can start? First, let's start with identifying your constraints. After you've identified them, your next goal is to automate and scale them. Now, constraints or bottlenecks. These exist within every organization. Constraints slow down your output. Constraints cause frustration and they cause pain. Ultimately, constraints are disadvantageous. As technology leaders and visionaries, it's our job to identify them, even when they aren't apparently obvious. A constraint, it can be a person, it can be a group of people, it can be a process itself, it can even revolve around the technology that was used at one point in time that's still being used. Now, how do we find a constraint? Let's look at the organization that you're working in today. Look at who is working. Look at how they are working. And look at what they're working on. Identify your digital pipeline or technology-derived value supply chain, as it may be called, and identify where these problems exist today. The biggest areas that can potentially lead to finding constraint is identifying how your team is building, testing, and deploying their applications. It's amazing what can happen when you aim to achieve this entire process in 15 minutes or less. When you are comparing your engineering teams to those found on those high performance teams that were mentioned in this slide, for example, do you think that they would be happier if they could see the impact of their contributions within a smaller feedback loop? My personal experience suggests engineers are much more happier and productive when they get an opportunity to work on high performance teams that put the effort into building these tool chains that allow them to deploy like these guys 50 times or more per day. You know, if you contrast these engineers to where they might land on the conventional team, where say they're deploying once a month, they might feel more disconnected from their work and likely are disconnected from the mission of this organization. High performance teams think digital first and use these tools to solve their engineering problems so they could address their customers' problems faster. Now, another area of practice is focusing on a declarative modus operandi. Is your team still doing everything manually, such as setting up servers, deploying software, and configuring backups? This manual way of working is known as an imperative workflow. Digital unicorns and mature digital first teams have moved towards better ways of working, where they've found ways to commit all aspects of their infrastructure and the application along with the app's config declaratively as code. This code ties into an orchestrator, something which could be represented by Kubernetes, which provisions and maintains that state, removing the requirement ultimately for imperative approaches or human intervention when you're deploying these live systems. When we move towards this way of working, there is much less reliance on humans for manual changes and possible undocumented components that might be required for the app to function. And it also eliminates human error from sabotaging deployments. I've always said, let humans focus on human tasks, like being creative and designing new solutions to old problems. Let computers do the repetitive drudgery work where the precision and attention to detail is key. Play to the strengths of your team. Empower them with the tools that they need to get the job done. Avoid having to rely on one person. Avoid putting pressure on sort of rock stars that might exist on your team, as that one person does become a risk to the business and ultimately can be a constraint if that person were to get sick, burn out, or leave. Don't foster a Dennis Nedry. This is an extreme example. Now, another important difference between doing things declaratively versus doing it imperatively is less emphasis on individual resources that require high amounts of human touch, and more emphasis on patterns of deployments where your compute resources are ultimately identical to another and function to provide a farm-like approach to your digital problems. Now, the analogy here I like to use is pets versus cattle. So pets here on the left are your classic monolithic applications that reside in your data center. They're given friendly names like Web Server 1 or some interesting name, maybe the favorite character of maybe like Luke Skywalker. They're unique, is what I'm trying to say. They're configured by hand and they're monitored meticulously. And if they get overloaded or break, we typically just allocate more CPU and RAM to them. When they do have problems, we manually log into them and we fix them or revert to a backup where it was working fine. Ultimately, we're forced to vertically scale with these pets, and they're not agile, nor are they portable. They can grow quite large over time. And the thought of encountering an issue with them actually creates panic likely in your technology teams. You can almost imagine this as kind of like a giant T-Rex. Now, cattle, on the other hand, are given numbers like VM0041 or a UUID. They're identical to the other cattle. When one of your compute resources gets ill, we simply provision another one and we destroy the faulty one. During times of high load, we simply provision more cattle to handle this load. And when they aren't required, we destroy the additional compute and we scale back in. This compute architecture is ultimately immutable without any state. It does rely on network connectivity to the other resources it needs. A microservices architecture reflects this paradigm exactly. You can also imagine this cattle or this pack of microservices as a pack of velociraptors. And spoiler alert, a large enough pack of velociraptors can take down a T-Rex. So just keep that in mind. Now, moving towards digital transformation, faster releases, agile methodology, I've pointed out 6 technologies here that have been incredibly transformational when it comes to app design and app strategy. Every agile cloud native org uses these 6 technologies as a part of their core strategy. It's pretty amazing to me how much these technologies can radically transform business outcomes when they're properly implemented and part of a digital strategy. I also want to point out that the benefits of using them are not limited to the applications they have on the business from a technology point of view. It also increases your ability to retain and train talent, especially when your organization has a strong commitment towards open source software. To name a company which has embraced this very well, I'll pick on Capital One. Capital One has open sourced a tool, among others, called Cloud Custodian, which is a tool used for verifying and maintaining security posture in cloud environments. From their perspective, it gives external validation to a larger community that they've built a tool that is worth using. It also allows them to build a funnel. When they see others contributing to the project, that immediately sends a flag for recruitment to reach out to those contributors and see if they would be keen to join the Capital One team and help grow the bank. Initially, it was through a contribution to an open source project. This type of messaging invokes trust and confidence in a company's technology and the strategy of that organization. So it's important to keep these technologies in mind, not just for the initiative itself, but also as a wider and longer term vision of what your organization is trying to accomplish when it comes to other verticals like hiring, retaining, and training your talent. So we've reviewed transformative technologies, but I'd like to represent today's modern app deployment landscape into these 4 quadrants. Now, the differences between classic apps and operations, which I consider monolithic apps, and the more cloud native apps and operations, which I would consider more microservice oriented, are demonstrated here. So you can see on the classic side, between on-prem and in the cloud, you have rigid and expensive challenges. Whereas when you're looking at cloud native, you have scalability, availability, and portability as common factors between these quadrants. The on-premise apps are typically built to host monolithic apps, and they sit in data centers. These are the pets that we were just talking about. This is conventionally where these applications live in most enterprises. This isn't how we want to develop anymore. This is outdated. Cloud native apps are built with those 6 transformative technologies from the get-go. They're already built to scale. They stay highly available, secure, and operationally agile. Config state is stored separately from the app runtime, and we deal with our deployments in terms of cattle instead of pets. Now, this is where you want to be as business leaders. This is where you want to put your applications into. If you're looking at a greenfield opportunity right now, you should be looking at deploying it in this methodology. Now, how can we get to cloud native? One approach is what I would consider the rip and replace. When we engage in a rip and replace project, we're looking at taking what you're running on-prem and replacing it entirely with something cloud native using these transformative technologies. These can be very complex, and there's always a cutover or a series of smaller cutovers to avoid any impact to the customers that are using the code. A lift and shift is a simple in-place migration of the on-premises app into a public cloud environment. It requires no refactoring of the underlying app itself. It's beneficial that it's in the cloud as it removes the requirement and reliance on this on-prem data center, which could result in lower total cost of operation. But it's still considered a monolith. You still have to scale that app vertically, and the portability issues will grow as the business grows. Improve and move is where we take the best of both lift and shift along with rip and replace and combine them. Now, the first verb here is improve. That means first taking into consideration the DevOps practices that permeate cloud native app engineering. This gives you and your team an opportunity to refine how you work, identifying those constraints and adopting new tools and methodologies within that existing software stack to make those improvements. Possibly even leveraging public cloud for platforms or elements that you might be missing out on premise, like databases, load balancers, big data services. The move part of improve and move comes later. After your app has been modernized and is cloud native with a microservices architecture, now you can take advantage of its portability and host it wherever you see fit, whether it is on the cloud or on premise. And going back to my original comments about Kubernetes, I highly encourage you, if you aren't doing it right now, to begin adopting your greenfield and existing migrations to be Kubernetes compatible deployments. Because like I said before, Kubernetes equals cloud native. Now, before I end, I just wanted to leave you with some recommended reading. These publications are exceptionally phenomenal at delivering core messaging around DevOps and agile development practices. And in particular, the first title, The Phoenix Project, is quite an entertaining read. I highly recommend you start there if you haven't read this book before. And if you haven't seen it, watch Jurassic Park. And thank you. I appreciate you guys giving me the chance to give this talk. So now's a good time for questions.
All right, then thank you so much, Aries, for that presentation and that energy, much like the weekend energy in your delivery. So thanks a lot for, that wholesome presentation that you have delivered and, helped us define on how CIOs and CTOs can accelerate digital transformation through cloud platforms. So yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. To our viewers here, if you have any questions, now is the time, and we can, open the session for the Q&A. So raise hand if you have any questions, or you can also put it in the chat.
I'm just replying to Ananda, who asked the books, The Phoenix Project by Gene. Yeah, no worries.
Any questions from the viewers here? We have the time now.
Thank you, Srinivasan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And if anyone doesn't get a chance to ask a question, I forgot to mention this at first. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love to meet new people. I love to learn about what they're doing. So don't hesitate. Oh, I have a question here. What would be the best strategy to migrate a monolithic app to microservices? That's a good question. So it would be easy for me to say, just go in right now and look at refactoring it or replacing it. However, without knowing much about the monolith itself, it's impossible for me to make that general recommendation. Typically, when you've engaged in building a monolithic app, I find that 9 times out of 10, it's because you're rapidly prototyping something and you're in a position where you didn't consider the tech debt considerations that you were putting into the product. And now you've achieved success and you're looking at scalability issues, thus resulting in this monolithic app that you're trying to decouple from one another. Give your engineers a chance to first analyze the components of the monolith and start splitting them into microservices themselves. And I would argue that looking at something like Kubernetes, where you can deploy your containers into pods and have them communicate with one another using technologies like gRPC or just HTTP to be super simple, gives you that same level of control. From there, you can begin to test the app until you get to the point where you can maybe run an A/B test with either the same app or perhaps a newer version of the app alongside the old monolith, until your customers no longer see the difference, and then you could completely decommission the old monolith. Now, that's very broad advice, but I think that's one potential strategy that you could take.
All right, we have a raised hand here by Jeevan Gomez. So,
oh, sure.
Yeah, we can give the time now.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeevan.
Oh, hi, Aries. First of all, thank you. On a weekend, you took time to present this very, very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Made a lot of got some insights from the presentation. Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned is about Kubernetes being used for cloud deployment. Other than Kubernetes, are there other methods for deploying cloud apps and stuff? I'm pretty new to cloud, so hence my question.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Kubernetes, the reason why I love Kubernetes so much is because it has a very common management plane that, like I said, gives you portability to run your applications across multiple environments. So you don't have to feel constrained to a specific vendor or cloud service provider. If you don't want to go the Kubernetes route, and that's perfectly okay, it's still, you could still build a microservice oriented architecture, but you might have to make some trade-offs, such as maybe attaching yourself to the cloud service provider at the hip when it comes to the proprietary technology solutions. Instead of using Kubernetes to orchestrate the containers, you could use container runtime services like ECS or Cloud Run from Google, ECS from AWS and Cloud Run from Google. What these technologies do is they still support the same paradigm of deploying your services as microservices and effectively leveraging the VPC networking technology from the cloud vendor instead of typically it's the same technology which is present in the vendor's Kubernetes distribution as well, which runs on the cloud. But like I said, it's just a difference of interfaces. You have to go with what your team knows. One thing I failed to mention during the slide, which I'll mention now, is you should never start a big initiative with a lot of change, because that's the quickest way to alienate both yourself and your and your team. You have to make change incrementally, and you have to build upon the strengths that you have as a team. So when you go from monolith to microservice, that is a smaller step than, say, going from no digital strategy to an entirely digital first strategy, where we're going to enable all of our lines of business with digital technologies. Go piece by piece, have an idea of where you want to be, and then map it to where your engineers are capable of working with, and understand what their what motivates and drives them as well. Engineers like to work on cool stuff, and they want to work at organizations where they don't feel bogged down by bureaucracy and processes. The more we go into the digital native cloud first approach, the more technologies you'll find which are accelerating this sort of velocity, allowing things like deployment, build, and testing to happen at a much faster rate, which allows them to accomplish those sort of faster and more deployments throughout the day or week. Whereas traditional waterfall approach would be like develop, and then deploy, and then wait and see what the customers respond. That's outdated. So we want to consider go agile first, go digital first, and don't feel constrained to Kubernetes. You go with whatever the engineers feel like using, but consider the microservices approach always.
Okay, so microservices especially good for incremental changes. Is that the bottom line? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'd say incremental changes first above all, and small changes a little bit at a time.
Thank you, Aries.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question in the chat by Naveen.
Yeah, Naveen.
Mhm.
Thanks, Aries. Can you please suggest how to increase the frequency of deployment? How to automate a few steps to understand, but how do I ensure build is tested fully without no issues? So let me tell you one thing, there will always be issues. What matters is how confident and how much risk you're willing to take when you go and deploy. Now, I hate to say it, but you need to take the existing set of tests you're doing and automate them first and foremost. And this doesn't include just unit tests and integration tests. This includes smoke tests, load tests, security tests, migration tests, anything that you feel is required in order to automate what is a manual QA and deployment process. See how much of that now. However much of that you can automate, say to yourself, okay, great. Now you identify the gaps, identify the areas which you haven't been able to automate, because that's basically the level of risk that you're exposed to. And you have to find a level of risk that ultimately you're comfortable with, because you're not going to be able to test 100% of everything. I mean, you should. Ideally, that's a great place to be. But especially initially on this journey, you're not going to be able to. So you're going to have some faith. You're going to have to take some leaps of faith, both in your teams and the trust that you have in the process or the software in order to deliver the results that you're looking for. When I said 15 minutes, I mean, that's a very good goal. But honestly, I would aim for anything less than that. I've worked on teams where we went from this whole cycle, CI/CD cycle, taking 1 hour to down to 15 minutes. And we immediately saw an improvement in the product quality and also what the customers were saying about the product. We also saw the engineers feel more empowered because they can see that the work that they're working on can immediately get an iterative feedback loop much faster than what would have been before, which is after I do my pull request, I disconnect mentally and I move on to another task. Context switching harms productivity, and giving your developers the capability to get as much data and insights out of the platform, which is what they're using to develop the app, is a key goal here. And ultimately one of the key metrics to driving that value through a digital transformation initiative. So there's a variety of tools out there. I mean, we're working on a tool which helps standardize this, but you can go to companies like JFrog, Sonatype, VMware, Google, Amazon, Microsoft all have cloud native tool chains for doing app deployment. Azure DevOps is a very powerful tool, as is GitHub Actions. It really depends on what your app is, how you're testing it, and ultimately your commitment to maintaining that sort of 15-minute metric.
All right, great. Thanks, Aries. I think we can take like 2 more minutes into this Q&A session. So if anybody has any other questions to ask our speaker, please take this time ahead and we will wrap up after this. Yes, I think we have one question in chat. We will take it as the last question
from
for the
Raghunath. Yeah. So what is your views on choosing the technologies and cloud providers? Is all the cloud providers are monitoring some sort of, okay. So I might get in trouble by saying this, but I think it's interesting what's going on, because on some level, we have cloud providers, which all provide a common set of infrastructure services. And I refer to those as block and tackle services like VM, storage, and networking. Now, the differences between the vendors, the cloud service providers, when it comes to those services are few and far between. Like if you need a VM, it really makes no difference whether you're getting one from AWS or Google. What you want to look at when you're deciding who you want to align with is what are the other sort of extra benefits you get from using, let's say, Google versus Microsoft. Microsoft, for example, has a very strong story in the enterprise space. I mean, it's baked into like Windows Server these days. So if you're a strong Windows shop, Azure is a strong consideration. They also have interesting tools which others don't, like Cosmos DB, for example. Google is extremely advanced when it comes to AI and ML because, I mean, they created TensorFlow, they created Kubernetes. They also have a very powerful Knative solution, which is Cloud Run. And the most important of all, which I failed to mention, is BigQuery. BigQuery is an incredibly powerful tool for querying and analyzing very large data sets in a very short period of time. AWS is the biggest. They're the first mover, so they have that advantage. I wouldn't fault anyone for going with AWS. It's a safe bet. But when it comes, if I were to start fresh, and this is just me speaking, I would prefer to go with something which is extremely developer friendly, which honestly they all have. I'm a bit impartial to Google because I think they have a great UX, and I really like their BigQuery and GKE products. But ultimately, it's up to you. It's also worth noting that depending on the size of your transformation, it's worth contacting the vendors directly because they can often give you incentives to move your compute onto their data centers. There is a concept of data gravity when it comes to public cloud. Once you put an app and once it's successful, it's going to continue to grow. Its costs will hypothetically go up. So just keep these things in mind. There's all sorts of ways to save money in the cloud. But really align yourself with what you're trying to do and then pick the vendor and let them help you understand how to get to where you need to be. You can also ask me or any other third-party sort of cloud partner for help in this process. We do this day in, day out. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, then that was Aries for us today, product architect with Cloud Cover. Thank you so much, Aries, once again for this wonderful presentation. Everybody here has enjoyed it. I can see it in the chat. Everybody is appreciating this session, and it's all because of you. So